Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. So for our Chinese-speaking audience, I'll say 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. Okay, so our topic for today is the White Horse Dialogue, a dialogue traditionally attributed to someone named Gongsun Longzi. Some people call him a sophist, a philosopher in the Mingjia or School of Names school. He's a representative of a kind of early Chinese philosophical discourse that seems to be, to many people, largely about language and semantics. There's always this thought that among later critics of this school of thought that they were just engaged in language games, that they weren't serious. I'm not sure if this is fair or not. I suppose we'll discuss it at greater length when we read the dialogue itself. But some people think they're not so concerned about truth, but just kind of wowing their audiences with these stunning conclusions on the basis of maybe abuses of language. Anyway, so we're going to be reading that. And it's a very interesting dialogue itself. It's just, you can't read it without being sort of intrigued by the semantic, rhetorical, logical moves that are being made. But we're going to read it for a number of reasons, not just because we're interested in the content itself, but because there are a number of questions that specialists in Chinese philosophy, people who are interested in Chinese philosophy, often raise about the tradition. Here's one question that comes up sometimes. When you read other philosophers that people are quite interested in, like, say, Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher, the Zhuangzi, the Taoist text, it seems at times that the Zhuangzi is, poking fun at or objecting to certain other ways of doing philosophy. And so sometimes when you read secondary scholarship now, they'll say Zhuangzi is targeting or attacking or critiquing rationalist approaches to philosophy. And when you hear that, you should be asking yourself, who are these rationalists? I mean, rationalism is a term that, we use all the time in Western philosophy, but who exactly were the people that could be targeted? Who would the authors have had in mind when they're making fun of or critiquing rationalists? So similarly, sometimes you see the early Chinese philosophers criticizing people who treat philosophy too much as a kind of source of entertainment, a language game, where they're not necessarily engaged in trying to figure out what's right or wrong, but using lots and lots of clever arguments and in some ways exploiting ambiguities in the language in order to lead people to absurd conclusions. That is what some people call sophistry, and it's a kind of parody of a certain kind of philosophy that other philosophers, sometimes Taoists, sometimes Confucians, object to. Who do they have in mind when they're targeting that kind of parody of philosophy? Well, they certainly have the White Horse Dialogue. Sometimes they make it explicit references to white horses and whiteness and hoarseness and so on. So finally, we're going to be looking at this object of criticism that matters so much to the other philosophers that we study, which is the White Horse Dialogue and the Gongsun Longzi, in which it's embedded, the larger text in which it's embedded.
Yeah, and it's an exciting dialogue. It is a bit challenging, but it also demonstrates how, these early Chinese thinkers were very much engaged with very difficult philosophical issues. And so we'll be looking at this text with our guest, Dr. Lisa Indraccolo. I'm not sure if I was saying that exactly right.
Indraccolo,
sorry, Lisa.
Yes.
Indraccolo is Italian, good Italian name. And we're also reading this partly because last year we asked listeners to nominate passages for us to discuss. And this was nominated by Peter Adamson, the famous host of History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which is a terrific podcast. And he's been running his own series on Chinese philosophy with Karen Lai, who's been on our podcast already. And she's been exploring the history of philosophy in China. And we certainly would recommend our listeners to listen to that podcast as well.
Yeah, I've been listening to History of Philosophy in China, the Adamson Lai series. And it's amazing, actually, how sometimes, Richard, they have released episodes on topics that are, if not exactly the same, still very close to, sort of in the conceptual neighborhood of topics that we've discussed, So I imagine it's been fun for some people to listen to them together. We highly recommend it, and we have a guest for today's discussion, a specialist in the White Horse Dialogue, in the Gongsun Longzi, the larger text in which the dialogue appears, and that is Lisa Indraccolo. And we look forward to discussing it with her after the intermission. Okay, and we're back, and we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Lisa Indraccolo, an associate professor at Tallinn University in Estonia. She's a specialist in classical Chinese thought, literature, and culture, especially the Warring States and Han period. And she's written extensively on the texts that we're going to discuss today, the Gongsun Longzi and other central texts in classical Chinese philosophy, such as the Han Feizi, by the way. So she's published a number of really excellent things about the Gongsun Longzi. We will be focusing in particular on her 2017 Philosophy Compass article on the White Horse dialogue. And that's just fantastic. It synthesizes a lot of information, not just about the original text itself, but all the secondary literature over the last, several decades on this dialogue. And she explains a lot of the dialogue's tricky logical moves, its kind of semantic or linguistic moves. And in any case, we highly recommend that article as well as her Philosophy East and West piece on the Gongsun Longzi. We're thrilled to have her with us. How are you doing, Lisa?
Hi, Justin. Doing well. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. You've been very kind. Thank you so much for having me, for the invitation. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Hi also to Richard.
Hello.
Hi.
It's nice to meet you, Lisa. I don't think we've ever met in person. Is that right? We're meeting now for the first time digitally. And I have to say, that's not an uncommon experience for me. I'm acutely aware of all these colleagues whose work I read faithfully, who work in Chinese philosophy or in sinology more generally, who are based in Europe, but I rarely see them. And I wonder, why is that exactly? I mean, I see my colleagues in the East Asian world, the ones, especially the Chinese-speaking world, all the time, but rarely my European colleagues. And I'm particularly mindful of it this summer because we're recording in August of 2025. We just had a couple of big events for Chinese philosophy in, I think it was Iceland and in Leiden. There are lots of gatherings. A couple of my graduate students went to those gatherings.
Yeah.
I missed them, unfortunately. But anyway, it just makes me wonder, why is it that the Europe-based scholars of Chinese philosophy and the North American-based scholars of Chinese philosophy so rarely interact directly? Is it because our common ground is China, maybe, and not Europe? I imagine if you're a Hegel scholar or a Kant scholar, then of course you're going to go to Germany now and then because that's the common ground, right? Mm-hmm. But in this case, I have no good excuse to go to Europe.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think, of course, I'm familiar with your work, and I think we only met digitally. We might have crossed paths at some online event, but we actually have never met yet in person, which I hope will happen sometime soon in the future. But I think that's absolutely true. And that's also something that I always say to my student, you should also go to the US conferences. I think there's definitely the practical problems of having very different schedules. The American semester is quite different from the most of the European ones. So that's is true. Definitely something that comes in a way. Sometimes it's complicated to invite guests from the US towards the end of August, which instead works very well for us, for instance, because of course your semester has already started. There's also a lot, I think, of misapprehension about the different academic cultures, in the sense that I think many Europeans think of Americans like, just Europeans that live across the street. But we actually come from different academic cultures. There's also a different way of thinking of conferences. The European way is really much more convivial in a sense. Some scholars that attend European scholars often that go attend conferences in the US are a bit disoriented by the pressure, also by how intense they are. It's very different. And I think it's a very important experience for European scholars, but also you have to keep the dialogue going and you have to go to the US to do that. And that's really when the connections are made. And vice versa. It's also a matter of funding, of course. What we usually get is like more established American scholars who maybe spend the summer with their families in Europe, and then they pop up, of course, to conferences. Yeah. That, of course, there's also that issue, of course. But I think there should also be more dialogue about what opportunities there are and what kind of events are going on. I mean, the European Association for Chinese Philosophy now is quite well established. One of the conferences you mentioned was the one in Reykjavik. There were almost 200. Yeah, exactly. And there were almost 200 attendees from all over the world. And I think also making people more aware of what is going on in Europe, for instance, because of course, for us, we all know each other more or less. We know what's going on in Belgium or in Germany, but that's quite fragmented also. And I think also the work you're doing, bringing together people digitally, creating a community, a sense also of community is fantastic. And this is the kind of direction that really can improve and somehow create this kind of bridge across the ocean, I think.
Through the podcast, you mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I hope so. I think we hope so. Well, this is of the many good reasons you gave for this lack of kind of direct contact. I think our listeners will be interested in this one that you mentioned about the different academic cultures. And so this is sort of news to me too. So are you suggesting, forgive me if I'm oversimplifying things too much, but are you suggesting that academic conferences in Europe on topics like Chinese philosophy are more like dinner conversations, sort of casual and friendly, whereas Americans are more combative or something, or competitive or
Well, I think it depends also on the conference. Like, of course, different conferences attract different communities, but if you take the pace of American conferences, just the sheer amount of people who is there is so intense. You barely have time to eat. You're just running from panel to panel. Also, a lot of, for instance, interviews go on behind closed doors during conferences, which is something absolutely fascinating from a European perspective. This would never happen. But of course, from the American perspective, it makes perfect sense because it's also such a huge country. It's an opportunity to have scholars all together. It's a perfect occasion. I think also the convivial aspect, in a sense, is somewhat different. The pace is definitely more relaxed at European conferences. In a certain sense, there is, of course, the scientific part, but also the dinners, the coffee breaks. They're very important. They are very important to create, to introduce yourself to people, to create connection, to discuss works. There's a lot of work being discussed during this aspect. And I'm sure that instead is very strange for Americans who are not used to the European way to see people drinking over lunch, for instance, which is perfectly normal in Europe. But of course, that is something that you reserve for the evening when the job is done in the U.S. So
I like this European model, by the way. I would like to, maybe we can
You're
also
very welcome to join us.
I'm coming.
It sounds very appealing. And it confirms the stereotype that Americans are workaholics, that they don't see a need to schedule a break for drinks in the middle of the day. They have more panels, more presentations back to back, that kind of thing. I agree that can get really relentless. Yeah.
Now, real quick, Lisa, though, the American Philosophical Association meetings in America, they used to do the interviews, but, that's gone. So, which is kind of nice, actually. It was tough. I remember being a graduate student and you would go to the APA, the American Philosophical Association, and you would do these interviews. And it was, I heard it was even worse a couple decades ago, but gradually I think they've kind of dissolved. I don't think they do that anymore, right, Justin?
They might, but it's relatively rare. Most people interview on Zoom. And you would go to this professional conference, the primary purpose of which was to share research. But if you had gone there for interviews and you'd had a bad interview, well, then you would be a little reluctant to go out in public. You'd be hiding in the bathroom or what have you because you didn't want to encounter these people.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
All right. Yeah, let me introduce the text here that we're going to discuss for today. So we're going to discuss with Lisa a classical Chinese text known as the Gongsun Longzi. And on a certain telling of Chinese intellectual history, which may not be entirely accurate. I guess some of this we just don't know, like a lot of classical Chinese texts. But Gongsun Longzi lived roughly around 320 to 250 BCE and was among this famous group of scholars known as the Mingjia and often termed as the school of names. Although I think, Lisa, you mentioned that, there are many sinologists who would take arms with using that label. But anyways, so he's usually taken as a clever sophist. So the most famous sophists, some of them belong to the ancient Greek tradition, of course, and they're known to be able to argue for almost any position and have a disregard for truth, which is why Socrates really disliked them. Now, the Confucians criticize the school of names folks because they think they're just arguing for argument's sake. And Confucians are big on, having a moral direction, right? Moral self-cultivation. But just arguing as Mencius, he thinks there's no point to it, really. So anyways, this text, the Gongsun Longzi, it's a composite collection of 6 chapters and only a few dialogues have survived. And we're going to discuss, I think, what is probably the most famous one, which is often referred to as the White Horse Dialogue. And I read this dialogue many years ago when I started teaching classical Chinese philosophy. I didn't know about it in the way that I knew about the Analects and the Mengzi. And I found it really interesting. It's really cool in some ways because you can see that there are some serious reflection starting to happen about the nature of language and metaphysics and the connection between words and objects and so on. So, yeah, I'm really happy to discuss this with an expert. And so I'm happy that Lisa will help us work through this important text.
Yeah, that's right. We are going to read the dialogue itself. And as usual, because it's rather long, we've broken it down into parts. I think we've decided that we're going to read 4 parts. We'll see if we have time to get through all 4. And we've named each part. So maybe we should discuss that now.
Yeah, so to keep this conversation focused, we're going to go through the key passages as discussed by Lisa in her terrific paper in the Philosophy Compass, which really captures the core logical moves of the dialogue. And Lisa is going to guide us with some commentary on some of the ambiguities, logic, and some of the overarching stakes. Okay, so the way we're going to read this dialogue is there's really 2 characters in these dialogues. There's the persuader and there's the opponent. And I guess Lisa and I will take turns reading. I'm going to represent the opponent, and Lisa's going to represent the persuader. And
yes.
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth saying in advance that the persuader, it's natural, of course, to look for the author's own voice, Which position does the author stand behind, People read Plato's dialogues and they say, Socrates speaks for Plato. And of course, some people raise doubts about that. Anyway, it seems like the most likely spokesperson or mouthpiece for the author here is the persuader. The opponent is more like the naive kind of, almost, is this fair to say, kind of simpleton who asks these questions that come out of common sense. And the persuader is this person who's sort of raising doubts about common sense ways of thinking of language and so on.
Yeah, kind of like the Socratic dialogues, right? There's usually a kind of an interlocutor who's kind of naive and answers questions, and eventually Socrates just gets at him, with various techniques. But so I'm going to represent the naive youngster here, and Lisa will represent the mature, wise debater, the opponent, the persuader, and I'll be the opponent. And this first passage that we're going to read, we've labeled it shape versus color. So yeah, Justin or Lisa, anything to add before we start reading?
Yes, this introduces the key phrase. So it's called the white horse dialogue. Sometimes people say it's a paradox. They say this is a discussion of the white horse paradox.
Yeah.
And the white horse paradox, in a nutshell, is the claim that a white horse is not a horse. So what you're to be on the lookout for is essentially a persuader's arguments for this claim that white horse is not horse, which seems paradoxical or seems wrong on its face. But I think it opens actually with the objector.
Yeah, that's also a small point I would like to make, that actually in the original text, there's no opponent, no persuader. We just have 2 anonymous people speaking, and we only have a verb introducing direct speech. So it's not even important who is actually speaking. What really is important for whoever collected this collection was the argument in itself. So we really have this back and forth between 2 people discussing, but this could be applied to any time, anywhere, anyone, basically.
Yeah, it's sort of an abstract dialogue. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to read this first part representing who we'll call the opponent. And the first line reads, "To say that white horse is not horse, is that admissible?"
And as the persuader replies, "It is admissible."
The opponent replies, "How is that possible?"
And the persuader says, "Horse is what denotes shape. White is what denotes color. What denotes color is not the same as what denotes shape. Therefore, I say that white horse is not horse."
Okay, good. So the objector is already skeptical, it seems, about this claim, white horse is not horse, and asks, is it admissible or not? And the persuader, sort of the kind of spokesperson for the more sophisticated author, says it is admissible, and the persuader explains why it's admissible. Because horse is a term that we use to denote shape. White is a term that we use to denote color, and denoting color is not the same thing as denoting shape. Therefore, obviously, white and horse aren't the same. Now they go on to say white horse is not the same as horse. All right, there's so many things to say about just this short little bit, actually. The first is, I think it's tempting to say right from the start that it seems like maybe they're kind of speaking at different levels, that the dialogue is, in some sense, that the objector and the persuader are thinking about these phrases, white horse and horse, in different ways. The objector seems to be skeptical about this claim, white horse is not a horse, because they're thinking, because, Richard is the objector, right? Because Richard is thinking that, of course, white horses are horses. If you look at any particular white horse out there in the world, it's an example of, it's a specimen of horseness. It's like, there's like this whole class of things that we call horses. So Richard, the objector, is thinking about actual horses out there in the world, where it seems like the persuader quickly moves to discussing language, because the persuader is talking about how this word horse is used and how this word white is used. Horse denotes shape, white denotes color. And so it seems like maybe they're talking about different things in a sense. So just as if, let me think of two different terms that refer to one and the same thing. We have my cat, Tove. Tove is his name, right? That's one way of referring to my cat, Tove. Another way is to say that gray cat that lives in my house, that lives in my home. Now, those two phrases mean different things. My cat, Tove, and the gray cat in my home, they actually have different meanings, right? But they refer to one and the same cat. And so it's almost as if like the objector and the persuader are arguing about different things. I'm trying to say, hey, my cat Tove is the gray cat in my home. Whereas the objector is saying, no, these mean different things, right? How's that as a first pass interpretation?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's the whole point. Actually, we normally expect like the climax to be reached like in the middle somewhere, but you already have in this first passage everything you need to know about these two positions that are clashing and the different perspectives, and also where really the issue arises, because the opponent is, of course, talking about real horses out there as if there were an actual horse in front of them, a white horse. And of course, everybody would just realize, yes, of course, it's a horse based on the knowledge they have of this kind of animal. While the persuader is clearly saying, yeah, but we are not talking about actual real horses. We're talking about what can we say about horses and how what we say influences the way in which we think of the horses and also act upon them, as we will see later on. And what is also very important is this difference about is not a truth claim. We're not saying that a white horse is exactly the same as a horse. There's this important difference that is also reflected in the grammar of the original text, because we have this negation, fei, which can mean not to be something, but also not to be the same as something else. So what the persuader is really arguing is that the white horse is not exactly the same as a horse. So there's something that them, despite the fact that, of course, they do have some sort of underlying similarity because they're both horses, there's still something also that makes them different. And where the different lies is really what they will disagree about. And it's also very clear. We also start introducing this important aspect that persuader is adding to the definition and also the image that we start to make ourselves of this horse, because the white horse is qualified by the fact that it has the shape of a horse, all the characteristics that the horse has to have to be recognizable as being a horse, but it's also white. It's also expressing a color, a particular color. Instead, when we talk about generically horse, it can be whatever horse of any size, race, color, doesn't matter. And the difference also that we have is the fact that we're not saying that in under any circumstances a white horse is not a horse. We're just saying, would it be possible to argue under certain circumstances that we can't say that a white horse is not a horse? Are there cases in which white horse is not exactly the same as horse? So that's the whole issue here, really.
Yeah, interesting. And so that's the way that we've been interpreting it, which I think is consistent with your interpretation in the published articles that I read, Lisa, is that the yeah, interesting. So the way that we've been interpreting it, which I think is consistent with your interpretation in the published articles that I read, Lisa, the persuader is immediately making this move to take this debate to what we might call the linguistic level or the linguistic plane. Now, we're not talking about any particular white horse or any set of white horses. We're talking about the phrases horse and white horse. Now, I should say that already is a little bit controversial, though, because there are some people who want to read the dialogue as though the objector and the persuader are kind of talking about the same thing after all. So like the way that you and I are reading it just now is to suggest that they're arguing a little bit at cross purposes. The persuader and the objector aren't talking about the same thing, but some people want them to be talking about the same thing. And maybe it's too soon to introduce those other theories. But as we go along, we might discuss some of the other interpretations. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's two things that they might be talking about here. So one is like the non-linguistic entities out there in the world.
Yeah.
But here it looks like, Lisa, you're saying that the way that the persuader goes on, really invoking this idea of admissibility, seems to be more about linguistics, or the way in which what we say is permissible within a certain linguistic context or something like that.
Yeah, that's the whole point. So it's a matter of what we utter and not like necessarily what is reflected in reality. Like, am I allowed to say that white horse is not horse? Will there be an occasion in which this actually reflects reality or a certain or is applicable to a certain situation? And that's exactly the difference. So here the difference is we're not talking about real horses or that we have there. We're talking about what we can say about reality and whether what we say can match reality under certain circumstances or when talking about things from a certain perspective. So we are really talking about the fact that is it conceivable that we could say something like that a white horse is not a horse, which of course to common sense it's absurd. But are there cases in which this is actually the only way to go to actually match reality in a sense?
Now, just to quickly follow up on Justin's earlier point, though, the initial statement by the objector, the natural reading I would have thought is that person is making a claim about white horses being a kind of horse, obviously. And then the persuader has seemed to, as Justin seemed to suggest, shifted like the discourse, like he's talking about something else now. Is that part of kind of the way that these dialogues kind of often unfold, or is it a kind of a clever trick here going on? Or it seems like he's shifted the
because it depends on what you mean by clever trick, but it could mean that could be a way of kind of devaluing it, Richard, and saying, oh, well, it's just a gimmick, right? It's just a way of showing that you've proven a statement wrong simply by reinterpreting the statement, And so in that case, it's not a very exciting conclusion. But maybe there's something more significant, meaningful, and consequential we can say about this trick too. Or maybe it's not a trick. That's the other possibility we need to entertain. Yeah.
Well, if you look at how dialogues are often constructed, and this is also normally considered a case of argumentation or argumenting, and often in these cases, but also in other examples of dialogues that we have in early Chinese philosophy, what you have is some sort of trigger that is then used by one of the two characters to somehow, move the whole dialogue into a certain direction. That, of course, favors the point they want to make or their own agenda or their point of view. So often these are also structured rhetorically in a way so that there is some sort of cue on which the other character can somehow on which they can take advantage of to direct the whole discussion somewhere else. And this is, in a sense, a clever move because we're suddenly starting to shift away from what is like the more normal approach to actually arriving in a situation in which the opponent, as we will see, will be forced to admit that what would be otherwise impossible, inconceivable, absurd, even offensive is actually something that we can actually say and have to say, and there's no other way out, basically. So he will somehow be cornered to agree with the persuader.
So in pursuit of that cause, cornering the objector, cornering Richard, the persuader then begins to discuss how these color terms are used. So that's what happens in what we're calling part 2 of the dialogue, which is meant to call attention to the fact that horse by itself seems to be kind of neutral with respect to the color of the horse, whereas white horse is quite clear that it refers to white horses only. So it seems like the persuader wants to call attention to this fact in order to corner the objector.
Yeah, absolutely. It's trying to somehow just play against the opponent by some temporarily assuming his own perspective, but just twisting his words in a way that eventually he will be forced to agree with him. That's what happens a little bit going on in the next part of the dialogue. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we'll call part 2 generic versus white horse. And this is just the persuader that speaks this time, I think.
Yeah. So the persuader goes on, if you were looking for a horse, both a brown horse or a black horse could be offered to you. If you were looking for a white horse, a brown horse or a black horse could not be offered to you. It is clear that admissible and inadmissible mutually exclude each other. Therefore, a brown horse and a black horse are the same insofar as they can both correspond to there being a horse, but they cannot correspond to there being a white horse. Indeed, it is true that white horse is not the same as horse.
Yeah, so the conclusion is, indeed, it is true that white horse is not the same as horse. And when you look at the argument in detail, it seems like the persuader has got to be talking about the terms white horse and horse, because it's about how these terms are used. It's saying, listen, if you're using the term white horse, say at a stable and asking someone to bring you the white horse, clearly you're limiting the scope of potential horses that can be brought to you just to the white ones and not the black or brown ones. Whereas if you say horse, bring me a horse, then obviously you're indifferent to whether it's black or brown. So that again seems to be more evidence for this view that when the persuader says white horse is not horse, this persuader is basically thinking about the terms white horse and horse. These terms are used differently. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What is also clever here is I'm suddenly bringing it back to reality and showing the opponent with a very concrete example, since he wants to talk about, supposedly he wants to talk about real horses, but then is then just picking an example from reality, real, like ordinary life. What if you're asking for a horse, then whatever horse, doesn't matter whatever color, you will get a horse. But if you want specifically a white one, then you need a white horse, not anything else, which means eventually that to say that you want a horse or a white horse, it's absolutely not the same thing. That makes a huge difference. And that's the same, of course, with example with horses of other colors, that they would fit or not fit to someone's request, depending on the fact that you just mentioned that you want horse, doesn't matter what horse, or horse of one specific color. So eventually it follows logically that just saying that you want a horse or a white horse is not the same. So eventually white horse and horse are not the same as well.
Yeah. While I'm at it, I hope it's okay with you if I make a point that it sounds sort of academic, but I think it's going to be useful for helping us to understand what's going on in this dialogue. When we say X is Y, when we say something is something else in modern English, that's ambiguous in a number of different ways. And that ambiguity is reflected in some sense in the classical Chinese that's being used here. So if I say a white horse is a horse, I could mean it in two different senses. One is we might call the kind of identity sense of this claim, white horse is horse. And the other is what we might call the subset sense of the view that white horse is horse. So the identity claim just says that X is Y. It says that the two things are the same. They're identical. So for example, English speakers, when they're very young and they're learning the names for various nationalities, they'll learn that people from Germany are German, people from Italy are Italian, and so on. Then they hear this word Dutch, and they look on the map and they don't see anything that corresponds to Dutch. There's no Dutch country. There's no Dutchland or something. So they say, what does Dutch mean? And that's when some adult will say to them, well, Dutch people are from the Netherlands, or maybe they'll be a little bit more specific. They'll say someone who's Dutch is either born and raised in the Netherlands or has citizenship in the Netherlands or what have you. That is an identity claim, right? A subset claim is different. If you say the Dutch people are people, or if you say, I don't know, cats are mammals or something like that, that's a subset claim. You're not saying that the whole set of all people is the same as or tantamount to saying, referring to Dutch people. Dutch people obviously just a subset of people overall. Cats are just a subset of mammals overall. And so anyway, if you say white horse is horse, you could be understanding it in the subset sense. And it seems like that's what the objector assumes, or you could be understanding it in the identity sense. And one line of interpretation that's available to us here is to say that the objector and the persuader are using these phrases in those two different senses, and that's why they're arguing at cross purposes. The objector is assuming that white horse is horse is a subset claim, what I'm calling a subset claim, whereas the persuader is assuming that it has to be a kind of identity claim.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, of course, several interpretations of the collection of texts of the Gongsun Longzi that have developed over the years, and also this idea of intersection of classes, for instance, that also goes with the idea of set theory has been developed, which says which identifies the white horse as the intersection between the set of all things white and the set of all possible horses, basically. However, as I think it will also become clearer as we move on, that's not quite how the persuader sees things, because what the persuader thinks is that the white horse is some sort of subset that is included in the set of all possible horses, rather than being at the intersection between white things and horse things in that sense. So that's also one important difference that basically runs between the opponent and the persuader.
Yeah. I forgot about that point, Lisa, that you make that point in your philosophy East and West article, the longer, more academic article. That's a really interesting point. Yeah. So, maybe this is neither here nor there for a lot of listeners who don't care, but just conceptually speaking, there are kind of two different ways of thinking about this phrase white horse. One is you can think of them sort of like a Venn diagram where you have two different circles, all white things on the one hand and all horses on the other hand. And it's the intersection of those circles that counts as white horse. That's one way of thinking about how this phrase white horse is being used. There's another way where we understand white horses not as the intersection between white things and horses, but instead as a subset of horses. In some sense, it's hard to specify. Horse is more fundamental, and whiteness is somehow like secondary. And Lisa makes this really interesting point on the basis of good textual evidence in the longer, more academic article, that actually it seems like the authors are thinking the latter way. White horse is, in some sense, a smaller circle that's fully within the larger circle of horseness or horses altogether. And it's not the Venn diagram where there's these two intersecting circles. Yeah. It's a cool point. Yeah.
What do you think the authors would say? What if all white horses were killed and there are no more actual white horses at all, and there are only brown and black horses, so there's no more actual white horse? Do you think they would be able to say, well, no, but we still have the idea or something like that? I wonder, if there would be the kind of conceptual kind of thought there that would still be able to abstract away from the concrete, actual reality of, there being white horses or not.
I do believe so, because the idea is that you could a horse, of course, has a certain range of colors, but what if we talk about mythical creature, for instance, that to which very different categories applies? When we talk, for instance, about omens, what we have is actually animals of very unconventional colors that then assume particular meanings. So the idea of being able to associate a color that should not technically even be associated to a certain object or animal or living being, whatever, is conceivable. So we can actually imagine or conceptualize things that might not even exist. So I think the possibility of thinking of white horses, even if they weren't all extinct, still exists in that sense.
Yeah, it's a good question, though. Yeah, it's one that at least on my interpretation, I'm not sure that the authors of this text anticipated it. What do we do about a world where there are no white horses? Maybe so. I think I read somewhere that some people think white horses were an extreme rarity, so it was somehow conceivable that there might not be any. But anyway, yeah, it's really interesting. I think having reached this point in the dialogue, we should probably mention what I think is the interpretive hypothesis that has received the most attention, just because it's so kind of creative and original but controversial, which is known as the mass noun hypothesis. I have to be careful as I say it, because I know that even native English speakers may not understand exactly what words I've used. Mass as in, the mass of something, the kind of, volume and size of something, and noun hypothesis. So this actually originally comes from Chad Hansen. So it's a tough one to explain, but basically the way we've been talking about white horses and horses up until now assumes that there's this thing that we want to call a class or a kind, which we can understand roughly. This is not entirely fair to the kind of the metaphysics of it, but it's something like a grouping, So there's this grouping of things that we call horse, and then there's this subgrouping of things that we call white horses, right? And one of the temptations when you read this dialogue is to assume that the author is exploiting an ambiguity in the language having to do with whether you're talking about groupings of things or just the identity of things. And some interpreters of the dialogue have been trying to read the dialogue more charitably, in some sense of the word charitable, trying to read it as doing something more sophisticated than that, exploiting this ambiguity. And one of those interpreters is Chad Hansen. So he's trying to think of ways of understanding the dialogue that don't presuppose that we're talking about classes and subclasses per se. And so he comes up with this really interesting idea that really for the authors of this text and for authors of classical Chinese texts more generally, all nouns, they don't belong to classes as we understand them. Instead, they're just individuals that are part of a larger mass or whole, and thus the term mass noun. So mass noun is actually a phrase that people use in linguistics. Sometimes they refer to them as uncountable nouns. For those of you who are English speakers, you will know you yourself use mass nouns, although you may not realize it. So an account noun, which is sort of its opposite, is basically anything. Like if you talk about cats or jars or, hairs on a head or what have you, those are all count nouns. You just assume that they have come in a certain number and you can't refer to them without specifying whether they're singular or plural. You either say cat or cats, right? For example. A mass noun is different. A mass noun is more like water or bread, And if you think about most situations where you try to talk about a quantity or an amount of water, usually you have to specify what quantity or amount it is. You don't say 3 breads, you say 3 loaves of bread or 3 slices of bread, right? And so you add this thing that we're going to call a kind of quantifier, or maybe we'll use the kind of Chinese term and say it's a measure word, which specifies the amount of, or even the shape of that you're thinking about. So you say 3 cups of water, or you say 3 slices of bread, or what have you. So now it just so happens that modern Chinese uses words that operate, at least grammatically, a lot like these words cup or slice in the case of water and bread, right? So, you say 一杯水, right? 1 cup of water, or 一片面包, 1 slice of bread. So the point is that modern Chinese uses lots and lots of these sort of measure words, which suggest, at least implies on Chad Hansen's reading, that Chinese speakers are thinking about all things as mass nouns. I should elaborate and explain that even for things that are countable in English, like cats, right? Those too require measure words. So you don't say 2 cats in Chinese, strictly speaking. You say 2 measure word cats, 2只猫, right? And so there's this really interesting idea that comes from Hansen that maybe for Chinese speakers, when you talk about the relationship between individuals, so-called individuals, and a larger whole, you're essentially understanding them as like slices of a larger whole, like you do slices of bread, or little bits of a larger whole, and not as members of a class. How's that? That's a really long-winded, but it's an attempt to explain this mass noun hypothesis. I guess we should say a little bit more about how it's meant to address the dialogue, how it's meant to be used as a kind of framework for interpreting the dialogue.
Yeah, you definitely did a very good job in trying to summarize because it's quite technical, but that is, of course, one of the most original, possibly, theories that has been elaborated. It has some issues, of course, as you also mentioned, but the idea is exactly that. First of all, horses would be conceived of as this singular entity that is scattered in the world in a discontinuous space. So basically that a horse is not like, as we imagine it, this kind of like class or genus, but it's basically horseness, horse stuff. And that applies, for instance, to the white itself. So basically a white horse is a combination of whiteness and horseness, or white stuff and horse stuff. And there's also 2 ways in which different objects or elements can combine. They can either be like combined together and become a mass sum. So it literally 1 plus 1 becoming this entity, or in certain cases, the 2 entities can actually interpenetrate and have this mass product. So these 2 ways. But basically the idea of Chad Hansen is, well, he first elaborated this theory because he wanted to somehow put some distance from other attempts that he of interpreting the text that he considered too much in depth to the Western classical philosophical tradition. So he wanted to do away with universals, especially categories, attributes, any abstract ideas. And he elaborated this theory according to which, instead, according to him, like the horse basically is actually, the white horse is a manifestation of this combination of horse stuff and white stuff combined together. Based on the idea also that according to his interpretation, there's basically in classical Chinese, you would not count horses. So according to him, there is this idea that all nouns would be working in this way, which, however, is disproved by the fact that you can count horses in classical Chinese as you can count, chariots or people. So that doesn't quite work, actually, at least also from a linguistic point of view, as fascinating as it sounds.
Yes. So I can tell Richard is chomping at the bit. Speaking of horse metaphors, that's an English idiom that means sort of eager to raise some objections to this. But just in order to make it really, really clear to the audience, including those who don't normally think about these issues in metaphysics and philosophy of language, you can think of this claim. Let's just say I'm pointing to a particular white horse and we'll call him Charlie. And I say, Charlie's a horse, right? You can think of this as a claim that could be true or false, admissible or admissible, in virtue of different things. And the kind of classical way of doing it in Western metaphysics, going back to Greek times and medieval times, is to say, well, there's this class of things, horse, and horses have certain defining characteristics or features. There's certain criteria a thing has to meet in order to count as a horse. So it has to be a certain shape. Maybe it has to have 4 legs. Maybe it has to have, function in certain ways, be capable of running or what have you, reproducing, and then so on. And if it meets those criteria, then it counts as a horse. Now, the problem with that view for some people is that it posits the existence of this thing, the class horse, which seems to have no particular place in the world, no particular location and time, And for some people, that's a very weird metaphysical posit, right? The furniture of the universe is thought to include lots of physical things that do occupy space and time and so on. But where is horseness? Where is this class of horseness? And so for that reason, there's some motivation on the part of people like Chad Hansen to look for a better metaphysical way of accounting for the difference between a whole group of horses and an individual horse. And so Chad Hansen says, given this mass noun hypothesis, given that the ancient Chinese thinkers thought of all nouns as mass nouns, as huge masses of stuff, they don't need to posit the existence of a class in order to explain how a horse relates to other horses. Instead, they just assume that, like water, horse stuff can be divided up. So when we refer to an individual horse like Charlie, we're essentially just saying, take a chopper and chop off one little block of this horse stuff. And that's Charlie. Charlie's one block of that horse stuff. No class necessary. No discussion of essential criteria that must be met in order to qualify as a class is required. And thus, we can just wash our hands of all the complicated and convoluted metaphysics that the Western philosophers have had to deal with. So goes the theory.
Can I just ask about that view? So Charlie is part of the entire horse stuff.
Yeah.
So what makes Charlie part of that? Well, because Charlie has this certain horse stuff shape, I guess. Is that the idea? And it resembles the entirety of a horse stuff, which is also horse shape. I'm just trying to conceptually understand this idea of when applied to horses. What do we mean the horse stuff? It's just a collection of all horses, right? I guess that's the idea, right? So the collection of all horses is what is meant by horse there, all the horses in the actual world. And then Charlie is made up of...
So you want to say, why do we say that Charlie belongs to horse stuff and not cat stuff or something like that? And so is your worry, Richard, that without an adequate answer to that question, we're just going to fall back on some absurd view that we just get to decide which
because originally the other way of thinking about it would have been, well, Charlie is a horse because Charlie has these various features or properties or attributes, and horses by definition have these kinds of attributes. On this other kind of mass noun interpretation, I guess how would the story go? So Charlie belongs to the horse stuff, and then how do we fill in the explanation of that?
It's basically a form of argument as a whole and part. So Charlie is a part of the whole horseness that is out in the world. But it's actually not clear how we define what a horse is, apart from the fact that it's called a horse, and we all agree that that's the name for that. I think that the text instead is going in a different direction, because what you clearly have also with this discussion about horses and colors, the fact that there is some kind of idea also that the white is a sort of qualification of the horse in a sense. There are also other parts in the text where you have more detailed descriptions of like what kind of qualities animals have to share to belong to a same supposedly category, basically, or genus. So, of course, this is a composite collection, so you cannot you're not necessarily able to read all these chapter as they were somewhat coherent, but they were clearly edited or compiled together in a way that they belong to a certain line of thinking. So we have to assume also, and they do make sense together if we read them from that perspective. I think Graham makes this point that things are not there, like they are supposed to have shape and color, not just be their shape, for instance. So in a certain sense, the horse is a horse because it does have the horse shape, which is the defining quality that distinguishes it from a giraffe or like any, I don't know, a table or a chair. It's a horse because it does have the shape of a horse. And I would also add certain other characteristics because it has to have 4 legs, for instance, to be a horse. It has to have a mane. It has to have a tail. So everything that somehow composes the shape of a horse, what we recognize as a horse shape, is what eventually makes it into a horse and recognizable as such. The white color instead is clearly an additional qualification that we use to describe one specific kind of horse. For instance, Charlie is a white horse. So it's going to also express that color so that if we're looking for Charlie, we already know we have to look around and look for a white horse instead of any other horse that's out there. So I think that already the text is giving hints. Even in the Baimalun, in the White Horse dialogue, we already have hints to the fact that the text is presupposing the idea that we have some sort of attributes that are defining things. And that's what also make them recognizable as what they are. So a horse is a horse because it does look like a horse in a sense. And this description that we have at the beginning of the shape and the color is very important, I think, in already given hints that that's the direction the text is going towards.
Yeah. A decade or two ago, and he wrote a response and said, "Oh, I realized it was a mistake some time ago." He gave a little account. Yeah. But it's still fun to have these positions to argue with just as foils, as kind of opponents, as kind of rhetorical opponents or conceptual opponents.
I find the idea interesting because there is kind of this broader kind of move that sometimes people want to make where you pick out certain features of like the language, let's say the Chinese grammar, the Chinese semantics, and then you kind of infer maybe a larger kind of worldview or a picture, a metaphysical picture. And, that's a kind of form of argumentation, I guess. In this case, I guess I was a little bit skeptical because we can count horses in Chinese. And depending on the context, everyone knows what they're talking about. And surely the horse sellers, they definitely want to count the horses and whatever. And also like some of these ideas, like, the fact that Chinese language doesn't have articles, or the. I mean, that applies to a lot of different languages too, like Korean and Japanese. And I just, being a native Korean speaker, I think we count things, all the time. And I mean, there's also, of course, different like ways we count things. Like we add a little ending after a certain term. Like for humans, we can add tul, and then that means like more than one. But of course, like Chinese has other ways of, referring to plural numbers. So I guess that's why I was a little bit puzzled about even the grammatical point.
Yeah, I want to say there's a period of time in Western academia when it was fashionable to, the way I'm about to put it is very loaded, but I'm going to say it anyway, to overinterpret certain structural features of language as somehow indicating something deep and profound and systematic about someone's worldview, So you see a lot of scholars doing this, and Chad Hansen first put this forward, in the 80s, I think? Mass-Noun hypothesis?
I think 76, towards the end of the 70s it started, and then it has some articles also coming up.
Okay, so late 70s, yes. That was a period when it was, I think, quite fashionable to do this sort of thing. You want to know what the metaphysics of the Chinese thinkers is? Look at the grammar various implicit assumptions that you see that are being followed in a kind of rule-like way in the Chinese language. You want to find out what the cosmology of the South Asian or Indian Buddhist thinkers is, look at Sanskrit or what have you. And of course, there were anthropologists doing similar things to a certain extent with various cultures they were discovering and so on. So that practice, by the way, I think is kind of out of fashion now. I don't know many sociolinguists or linguistic anthropologists who subscribe to that way of studying a person's culture, but it's still tempting. The temptation is still quite there. And I noticed, so Richard wanted to bring this up because it just doesn't comport. It's not consistent with your experience as someone who's a native speaker of two languages. You don't feel like that you think about the world as chunks of masses simply because Korean lacks definite articles like the. That's right.
Right. I mean, maybe one could, undertake that way of thinking about the world, but yeah, it wouldn't be an implication of the actual, like Korean grammatical structure. Yeah, but I've heard these kinds of arguments, like ancient Greek, the way that they have like concepts of existence, like kind of propelled them toward a metaphysical view, like Platonism. And then in classical Chinese, we lack that kind of grammatical structure and certain kinds of concepts and terms. And so that's why metaphysical speculation just wasn't done in early China or something like that.
There was definitely this period in which classical Chinese was considered allegedly to lack room for abstraction or just to be suitable to allude to things or to lack the kind of precision that is necessary to provide definitions. This is most definitely not true. There's perfectly room to express very definite ideas, provide definitions, or go into abstraction. Also in classical Chinese, the classical Chinese can be absolutely precise about numbers and plurals if they want to. So yeah, absolutely, that is not the case.
Among the many good articles that Lisa recommended to us in advance of this podcast episode was a really good one by Feng Youming, who basically takes the various interpretations of this dialogue and formalizes them, uses sort of formal, logical, various notation systems to represent the arguments and the presuppositions. And he points out in a number of ways that it's very hard to even conceive of these arguments, whether they're from the White Horse dialogue or other parts of the Gongsun Longzi, or for that matter, the so-called later Moist dialectics, without presupposing some abstract ideas, some terms that are referring to abstract ideas. Yeah, that there was for a while this desire somehow to suggest, it's weird now in retrospect, that somehow Chinese language itself lacked any reference at all to abstract terms, that there were just no abstract terms whatsoever. I still remember learning literary Chinese from someone who suggested that they didn't have counterfactuals in classical Chinese, which I think is actually strictly not true. So anyway, it used to be more acceptable to make these sort of sweeping claims on the basis of structural features of language. Yeah. So this gives us a chance, I think, now to move on to the third part of the dialogue, which for me is really interesting. We're going to call, Richard came up with the names for these sections of the dialogue. We're calling this the colorless horse challenge. So now the objector and the persuader are going to discuss whether ma, horse, the Chinese character for horse, is in some sense colorless. Really interesting.
Okay, so I'm going to read the objector part again. And it goes, You consider a horse of a certain color not a horse, but there are no colorless horses in the world. Are there no horses in the world then?
Persuader just replies, horses necessarily have a color. That is why you have white horses. If only colorless horses were horses and that was it, how could you pick out a white one? Therefore, a white one is not horse. White horse is constituted by horse and white combined. Horse and white combined are not the same as horse. Therefore, I say that white horse is not horse.
Yeah. Okay, right. So what's just happened? So the objector has basically said, wait a minute now. I think the objector is like getting a little bit more sophisticated. Is that safe to say? And not such a simpleton, not so naive, and is pushing back a little bit and saying, okay, wait a minute, persuader. If what you say is true, then you seem to be committed to this idea that horses don't have color, you know? And moreover, every horse I've ever met has had a color, you know? It's been white or brown or black or what have you. Doesn't it follow that from your sort of presuppositions that there are no horses? So the objector is kind of trying to turn the argument on the persuader. And the persuader responds, oh, no, I can see that horses necessarily have a color. And that's why it's possible to pick out a white horse from other types of horses. So I'm already conceding that point. The point is that it seems like this is now the persuader making even more explicit the point that she or they are talking about horse, about the words horse and white horse. Because then the persuader says, therefore, a white one is not horse, right? White horse is constituted by horse and white combined. That very expression, white horse is constituted by horse and white combined, seems like it's talking about the words, the terms, the characters, horse and white, ma and bai, right? It's saying that you get this phrase white horse by pulling these two terms together. Each one makes its own reference. It refers to its own sort of features or character traits in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that the persuader is making, because, of course, the opponent is taken aback because he would assume that the persuader is denying reality, is saying something absurd. He will be forced to admit that he is saying something that makes no sense, that is not applicable to the real world. But the persuader candidly replies, oh, no, of course, horses have colors. Otherwise, how could you possibly have a white horse? So it's kind of almost making a fool out of him, basically, saying, obviously, I can see that horses have colors, but here we're talking about something different and you're not getting it. So that's the point. Exactly. So that's really smug, actually. Yeah.
So I'm sort of pulled in two different directions by this particular move in the passage. So on the one hand, I'm still tempted by my view that the reason this dialogue seems profound is really because there's a kind of pseudo-profundity, that the objector keeps thinking, which is Richard is reading for the objector. So the Richard character is really thinking about the objects out there in the world, horses, some of which are white, whereas the persuader is really thinking about the terms white horse and white horse, the phrase white horse. And so the reason that it seems like there's this really interesting paradox is basically because they're speaking at cross purposes. They're talking about different things. So that's the kind of superficial reading of the passage. But it is intriguing to me that we're now at a point in the dialogue where the objector is raising questions about the possibility that there could be some sense of this word horse, which is itself colorless, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the persuader, I'm not sure, seems to be taking that on board in a sense. And so now we're beginning to see glimpses of the sort of, well, we'll say, kind of issues that have motivated some of the metaphysics that mentioned earlier in Western philosophy. So it seems like one way of looking at this particular move, this particular exchange between the objector and the persuader, is to say that the objector is now asking, oh, wait a minute, aren't you kind of assuming that there's some sense of this word hoarseness, in virtue of which we can say, something is or is not a horse, those terms, that phrase is admissible or not, which is itself colorless. It seems like maybe they're not talking about some abstract idea of hoarseness that itself lacks color. We're certainly not all the way to Aristotelian, much less Platonic metaphysics, or talk about universals or what have you. But it's a glimpse of worries of that kind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the idea that, the horse, like just taking horse, it could possibly have any color or none at all. We don't know about it, but it entails the possibility of expressing color without actively expressing or just picking out one specific color. So in a sense, it's a much broader term that encompasses all possible horses of any race, height, color, whatever, origin, doesn't matter. A horse is much broader in scope because anything that looks like a horse, walks like a horse is a horse. But instead, the white horse is something different. It's really picking out the white ones. And of course, this means that white horses must be part of this broader group of all the horses that exist in the world. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to pick them out somehow. But of course, white horse, saying white horse, picking out a white horse is very different from picking a horse because it does have this quality of expressing the white that is only in potency in horse. A horse can potentially express any possible color that a horse can possibly have. presumably in reality, but we can think of pink horses if we want to. Instead, the white horse is expressing one specific characteristic that it's in that way, it does match also the term white horse, because a black horse could never be called white horse, of course. So in a sense, the term white horse is richer in the amount and detail of information that is used to qualify the particular horse we're talking about. So we somehow go back to the argument that if you're looking for a horse, it's not quite the same that if you were looking for a white horse. But of course, you need to have white horses to be able to pick one.
Yeah, you're right. White horse is richer in information. Action guiding information we can use, or referring information, information we can use to refer to things out there in the world than horses. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering along the same thought as Justin earlier. So in this passage, when the objector says, are there no horses in the world then? I was wondering, if there's a sense of horse here, like as a kind of like a kind or a category that's being suggested, like, oh, then if we mean by this term horse, some kind of category, an abstract category.
That exists, right? That we can talk about like other existing things. You don't want to go that far.
Well, if it exists, then I guess that would be some kind of realism. Sorry, and that term just means like that, these kinds or categories actually exist.
Okay.
There's a whole metaphysical debate, I guess. But I mean, like, category or kind horse that's distinct from like concrete horses throughout the world that actually is alive and well. Yeah, so that was, or maybe I might have misunderstood your earlier point, but
that's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It was like suggesting that, oh, maybe you've been talking this whole time, persuader, that, or maybe you meant by the word horse here, Ma, just this kind or category, not concrete horses, which is what I was thinking of. But then, it is a little puzzling because the response now is, well, no, all concrete horses have a color. And I wasn't entirely sure this response, how it's supposed to connect with that further issue of like the distinction between like concrete set of all actual horses that we can go and look at versus this kind or category of horse. Which is an abstract object if you think they exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you do have a word for category, lei. However, it's not in the text. But for instance, if we look at the text or collection of chapters that come close to discussing similar points, which are the Mohist canons, which is this cluster of chapters that you have preserved within the Mozi, Master Mo, this other philosophical text associated with the Mohist school of thought, you do have a definition of category, of lei, and you do have similar examples. And it clearly seems like the two texts, the Gongsun Longzi and the Mohist canons, are in a dialogue. They have opposite opinions, but they are working with the same kind of jargon. They are, in a certain sense, like they are on the same plane. They're talking about names and how they match realities, and they definitely have a definition of category. So the abstract idea of what a category is definitely there.
Yeah, it's present in the ancient texts, in the classical Chinese texts. Yeah. Well, I'm eager to talk a little bit more about Lisa's interpretation, but maybe we should go ahead and read the last little bit of this part of the dialogue. That'll give us our excuse, our kind of launching pad for that. So the last bit we're calling the reductio ad absurdum. Now, reductio ad absurdum is a Latin term that refers to a particular style of argument. For those of you who aren't trained in philosophy, you'll sometimes hear philosophers say a reductio. They'll refer to something as a reductio. That's a shorthand for reductio ad absurdum. A reductio is essentially an appeal to the absurd to show that there's something wrong with a view. If a view is true, then something absurd follows, so that view can't be true. We just saw, you might argue, the objector attempting to do something like that by saying, if your view is true, then horses don't have color. And that's obviously an absurd conclusion, so the view can't be right. Now the persuader is going to run their own reductio ad absurdum. Yeah.
So I will start. The persuader goes on saying, if we consider that having a white horse is having a horse, is it admissible to say that having a white horse is having a brown horse?
The objector says it is not admissible.
Persuader continues, to distinguish having a horse from having a brown horse is to distinguish a brown horse from horse. To distinguish brown horse from horse means to consider a brown horse not a horse. Now, to consider a brown horse not a horse, and yet to consider a white horse a horse, these are the most contradictory and incoherent words in the word.
Strong language, yeah. Yeah, so as I read this last little bit, the persuader's trying to remind the objector that the objector's already conceded that brown horse is not the same as horse. And so having conceded that, they must also concede that white horse isn't the same as horse. So on pain of contradiction, right? So like, remember the whole thesis that launched this entire discussion is whether white horse is horse or not. And the persuader is saying, listen, you've more or less conceded my point that brown horse isn't horse. And so for the same reason, you have to concede that white horse isn't horse. Okay, yes. So that is just one bit of very many interesting bits of the white horse dialogue. And we were tempted to read some other parts of the dialogue, but we realized, first of all, take too much time and also get a little too technical. It's too bad, though, because there's a lot of other rich stuff in the dialogue. Maybe some other day, Lisa, we'll invite you back. But let's kind of step back from the dialogue and discuss it, I think. Maybe we could start by just setting the stage and saying there are a number of different ways of interpreting this dialogue that aren't necessarily inconsistent with each other. So like we could understand it as sincere, we could see the persuader as being really adamant about showing people that white horse is not horse. We could understand it as jokey or as a kind of entertainment, as a kind of a display of rhetorical skill. If it's just a display of rhetorical skill or entertainment, then maybe it's a bit more like what we in English sometimes call sophistry, alluding to those ancient Greek thinkers that we call sophists, people who could take any position and argue really vehemently for it and even persuasively for it, regardless of whether it's true or not. So that's one question, is like, do we take this as mere sophistry or do we take it as sincere in some way? Interpret that word sincere in how you choose, That's one question. Another one is like, what is the status of this claim about white horse not being horse? So I'm still, at the end of the day, tempted to say that the dialogue is basically teasing those people who are still tempted to conflate identity claims with what I'm calling subclass claims. And that really the persuader is just insisting again and again that white horse can't be horse because white horse isn't identical to horse. This phrase, white horse, doesn't refer to exactly the same stuff that the phrase horse refers to. So they're not coextensive, I suppose I should say. But then the temptation to say that white horse is horse just comes out of this natural feature of most languages, certainly classical Chinese, according to which when you say bai ma, ma ya, white horse is horse, you're just making a subclass claim, just like cats are mammals, or Dutch are people or what have you. You're just saying it's one subcomponent of a larger whole. So that's one way of reading it. But then there's lots of ways of understanding the relationship between individual and class, or maybe we should say between part and whole, between white horses in particular and horses more generally. And what's, I think, Lisa's sort of biggest step into controversy is in defending the view that there is a kind of attribute which is understood as something like a universal, bear with me, that's being presupposed in this dialogue. Now, the word universal, as it's used in sort of English or Western philosophical jargon, refers to attributes or properties that exist in some sense independently of any particular location, place, or time. Anyway, so that's one interpretation which is at odds with many other interpretations of the relation between part and whole or individual and class in the dialogue. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's still so much we could discuss here. On your first point about also whether this has a broader meaning or is just some kind of divertissement or whatever it was. Well, of course, what we have is this very, very dry kind of conversation. We don't have any context, but we know that there is a tradition of discussing this argument or paradox of the white horse, as well as a whole collection of similar arguments. Some of them have been lost, but there are lists of paradoxical theses, so-called, in other texts. So we know that people were discussing these. There are different ideas on why people would be discussing this, starting from the fact that it was some sort of training rhetorical training, arguing opposite positions. So very similar in a way to what be a sample of a pedagogical text or a dialogue that someone would study, rehearse to become proficient in this kind of rhetorical skills that were requested and required to survive at court, or in any case in the intellectual environment of that particular cultural historical moment in which there were these persuaders offering their services as advisors, diplomats, officials to local rulers ruling over independent states. So the idea that this was part of the training to become basically one of these persuaders who were then offering their services to kings at the time, rulers of the time. The other idea is, in any case, what we also see in anecdotes that we have about Gongsun Longzi, who was particularly famous, but also other similar figures in the received text, which of course, again, to a large extent are for sure fictional, still is the fact that this kind or this way of arguing was then transposed and used to somehow, find a way out of tricky diplomatic situations, or it was used in court. So there was also a practical application of this kind of what might look like sophistry or arguing for argument's sake.
Yes.
There's also another aspect. So the fact that there is what emerges from the White Horse dialogue, but also from other texts in the collection, is the fact that what is really at stake is the correspondence between names and what the realities they correspond to, so the actual thing or objects or people they correspond to. And this is part of a much broader discussion and concern that was shared by several thinkers, different intellectual trends, philosophical schools of the same time. So what do we call the gemmi? So the rectifying names, making sure that the way we call things actually correspond to those things, not just linguistically in the sense of accuracy, but also in the sense of roles and accurate descriptions. This also plays in part on the fact that Ming, the word for name, also stands for rank or title. And this was very much actual also in the political context when titles were usurped at that time. And there was this whole discussion about, do names mean anything at all anymore if we take out all the meaning from these political, social roles, in a sense? And that, of course, this is just, if we want, a very small example of what can be done when we give something the wrong name, or like we can really play with language. And this is powerful and also dangerous at the same time. So this is also an example of showing that anything can be said by someone who is good enough at arguing for it. And we see in other texts of the time, like, for instance, the Hanfeizi, so in the legalist context, but also in other texts, that people warning against these people who are skilled in this kind of abilities. So there is also a practical counterpart. These are not just, something very abstract, something crazy like a sketch that someone is just pulling off in court for entertainment. Of course, there were also debates going on that in part had a sort of entertainment aspect because they were performed at court. But there is much more at stake than what might look like at the first reading.
So in other words, you're saying, yes, it was entertainment. It was probably seen as entertainment, but it was not seen as harmless entertainment, right? Like the Confucians, for example, seemingly the Mohists and certainly the Confucians are quite explicit that it's a danger. And the objection, am I being fair here? The criticism is that it's dangerous because they don't seem to be taking maybe truth seriously enough. Is that right? They're not taking, or as you say, the correspondence to things out there in the world seriously enough. So just as Plato worried that the sophists were not taking truth seriously enough, and not just Plato, but lots of people have always worried about sophists not taking truth seriously enough. For them, it's just a game. You're just, you take a position for the fun of it or because someone pays you to, and it doesn't matter to you whether it's actually true or not. That bothers them a lot. And so similarly, it bothers Xunzi, for example, is famous for complaining about this, that the so-called Mingjia thinkers, like Gongsun Longzi, aren't really interested in tracking the truth. They're just interested in defending a position for the spectacle of it or something like that.
Yeah. And another issue is really what are someone's intentions when they engage in this kind of discussion? Because if we look into their Hanfeizi, but also, for instance, to take a famous Confucian being accused of engaging in argumentation, we have Mencius himself, who, while he criticizes, like many others, the resort to this kind of techniques, he is accused of doing the same. And eventually, he's not really convincing and defending himself, and eventually says, well, everybody's doing that. How could I possibly not do it? Because these are the times we live in. We don't live in an ideal world in which the sages are ruling. So I'm forced to do it because of everybody else is also doing so. Having a certain sense, that is the way in which the political debate is going on, and to be part of the game, but also in a sense to promote an agenda that eventually is supposed to benefit the state, or somehow to be truthful to your own principles and to support the ruler. You have to engage in this kind of rhetorical debates. And for that, you need the technique. If you don't learn, you're out of the game, basically.
Yeah, it's all really fascinating. I did want to ask you, Lisa, though, so we've gone through this dialogue, which, as many of the listeners have at this point realized, is very complicated. And you probably have to read it many times. It's easy to get lost. You've studied this dialogue extensively. What do you think is the best way to read this? Or what is the key takeaways for you? And yeah, Justin mentioned that, you have this kind of innovative interpretation invoking this term universal, which is a very, philosophically loaded term, although it's so important in contemporary metaphysics and even in the history of Western philosophy. But it's a deep, interesting, fascinating question, what universals are or whether there are universals. Yeah, can you say a little bit? Because I think we are running out of time, but I'd like to get your kind of final read on this dialogue.
Yeah.
All right. So I will say first that whenever we approach any text, but also classical text as well, the first thing is really to ask ourselves why these texts were written or to which audience they might have addressed. Because they are very sophisticated pieces, rhetorical pieces, and nothing is left to chance. They're carefully thought through. And that is why I always think that, well, sometimes, of course, there are lacunae. We can't do anything about it. But it's very important to really look at the structure, to really look at what kind of rhetorical features the text shows. And we really have to think, what was the purpose of this? And this is particularly important with the Gongsun Longzi because for a very long time it has been dismissed as not being serious, as not being worth reading, not being canonical. But eventually, as I always say also to my students, if people put so much effort in preserving this text, in amending this text, in filling in, patching some part of the text that went missing, if it has come to us, this required a lot of effort, energy in transmitting this text through the ages, because we know that eventually what has been transmitted is only a relatively small proportion of what was available on intellectual production that was also considered worth transmitting by librarians, by scholars. Whoever transmitted this text put a lot of effort in keeping it together throughout the ages. That already dismissed the fact that it doesn't matter. It clearly matters because that requires a lot of effort and intention in preserving it. So this must be considered meaningful, useful, interesting for some reason, not just for us as some sort of it. Of course, it is entertaining, but there must be some other use that someone can make of this text or some important point that this text makes. Regarding interpretation, I, of course, I somehow build on this interpretation in terms of universals, and I have a somewhat slightly different take from the usual one that goes more into the direction of abstract universals, which has been supported by Fan Yaoming, in the sense that reading also parts of the text that we didn't really have the time to go into deep into, there seems to be this idea that things, objects, living beings have expressed certain attributes. Some of them are more fundamental than others, and they really, in this case, would be the shape, in the case of the horse. We already have seen in the first passage that we were talking about the shape and the color. And throughout the text, we have seen that eventually what makes a horse, its horse-like shape, while it can assume very many colors. And we're also told that normally horses in the real world have colors. But we also have the idea of a horse that includes all potential horses, encompasses all potential horses in potency, not in action. And those particular horses which express additional attributes, for instance, the color, are in a certain sense mirroring this bigger idea of horse, which has the potential to express one particular color, for instance, or one particular race of horse, or other also attributes in other cases, in other examples that are also preserved in other part of the text. So there is this idea that some qualities are more fundamental and are really making something be what it is. And they cannot be taken away. Otherwise, that thing will stop being, for instance, if we take away the shape of horse, then it's not a horse anymore. It's a lump of flesh that we don't know what it is. But the color, we have seen, we can have white horses, brown horses, black horses, or many other different possible colors that the mane of a horse can assume. That is something that the horse in reality will have to express, but we don't know yet until it does. But in principle, a horse, it still has all the possibilities within itself as an idea to express all these particular characteristics. This means that the shape is a fundamental characteristic of the horse that makes a horse be a horse. The color is still a characteristic that the horse has to express in the real world because it belongs to it. Horses have colors. It's being said clearly also by the persuader. He has no problem in admitting that. But which particular color? It has a whole range of possibilities. And expressing that particular color will make it into a particular manifestation of this broader idea of horse, encompassing all possible horses of any height, of any color, of any particular race, etc., that the horse encompasses within itself. And also there is this idea that is expressed in certain part of the text that it's made even clearer that for instance, color, the manifestation of the color that is attached to the actual horse is just a sort of like reflection of the absolute color. So the particular shade of white that, I don't know, for instance, a pearl or a horse or anything else that is white assumes belongs to that particular object and is a particular manifestation of white, which in itself includes all possible shades of white. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I could, just to bring people up to speed about the status of sort of debates and interpretations of this important text, it's sort of like through Lisa, we've come full circle. So, but with a twist. So we had these other views that I mentioned earlier, like Chad Hansen's, that are trying to avoid positing like a class or a type or kind as a way of explaining the relationship between a white horse and hoarseness more generally and horses more generally. And then we had, actually, there was a period of time where it was very common for scholars of Chinese philosophy, even those who were native speakers of Chinese and worked in the Chinese tradition, like Feng Youlan, to use Western categories and frameworks to explain what's going on in the old texts. And so from that period, we have Feng Youlan, a very well-known sort of early 20th century scholar of Chinese philosophy, who more or less said that, yeah, this white horse, he interpreted the dialogue through the lens of universals understood in the Platonic sense, right? Plato's forms. And we have a later scholar that we mentioned earlier, Feng Youming. That's Fung, I think it's Yiu.
Yes, Ming.
Ming, M-I-N-G, the particular way of romanizing that name. So he also endorses this view that whiteness, for example, is in this dialogue necessarily an abstract universal, just as Feng Youlan does. He doesn't think that the dialogue is committed to all the Platonic metaphysics. It doesn't go full Platonism on us, but he still endorses that view. And then Lisa's view is intriguing, but I have to say, it's very difficult unless you're really sort of steeped in Hegel or something. But that the attributes are better understood, like whiteness, are better understood as concrete universals. So in other words, they're still universals. They don't exist in any particular place or time, but they're in some sense concrete. And for that, you have to think what I think of as sort of Hegelian terms about the difference between sort of partially and fully realizing a thing, right? And you do that by saying, well, in order to be a horse, you have to have horse shape at least. So you have this sort of essential property of horseness, which is horse shape. And you also have all these potential properties, like it could potentially be white, black, brown, or what have you, right? And by realizing those potential properties, it becomes more real, right? It becomes more fully realized. Is that correct?
Yeah. Basically, we have like a concretized version of these because, of course, we can talk of a horse, but eventually in the real world, we have seen that horses need to have color, for instance. So that particular horse, once we look at it, it will have to express the color. And that is a particularized manifestation of all the possible horses that still exist as an abstract concept somehow, because we need an abstract concept of horse to recognize that this is a horse. And of course, the fact that we can tell that this is a horse is the fact that literally its appearance, its contour of its body, and the physical characteristics it manifests, so the shape in itself, it's really that of a horse, basically.
So just to quickly clarify, it sounded like saying that we do have to posit, at least on your view, some abstract universal category of horse, and that the particular, let's say, redness, or I guess not redness, but like brownness of this horse is a concrete universal in that horse. So the brownness that the color this particular horse of mine has right here in this room, that brownness is a concrete universal. But it sounded like you were also saying, you're kind of, we do need to posit some abstract category also as well. Is that right? Or am I misunderstanding you? You can correct me.
No, that's correct, basically, because in another part of the text, you really have an explanation that horse, or white in particular, is the white, is not the one that you find manifested in the horse. In a certain sense, the white with capital W is not the white that we find in the horse, even though it partakes still of that.
Yeah. Isn't that just Platonism? That's exactly what Plato would say, isn't it? No, I'm trying to, maybe you are okay with it. I have some of my best friends are Platonists, so that's cool. But because Plato would say, the whiteness in this horse is an exemplification of the capital W whiteness, the Platonic form of whiteness.
Basically, the text doesn't go that step further to really say that the white is somewhat abstract, but it seems not to exist, basically. And it only exists, even though we can somehow postulate its existence, because we have to have this somehow set of all potential shades of white, for instance, that eventually we see manifested in the world. But what we can only see and testify is basically the particular manifestations. And if we put them all together, then we can somehow deduce an idea of whiteness. But it seems that the abstract idea is not there, basically. So it's something that doesn't quite exist as Plato would have it. It only exists in these concrete manifestations. But then from experiencing all these particular manifestations, then we can from that deduce the idea that there is white, and it is basically manifested in all these different shades, in all these different objects or forms in the real world. But what we only experience is the actualization in these particular forms of white, basically.
Yeah, that's why I'm tempted to say Richard's going to have a hard time even stomaching this view, because you just have to be comfortable with Hegelian, with Hegel-y in order to make sense of this view. So all this discussion of like what's potential and what's actual, the idea that a mere abstract idea is in some sense not fully realized, and thus, I think, not fully real until it's been instantiated in some concrete context, that itself is super Hegelian. And it's, if you haven't read a lot of that particular period of Western philosophy, then it might just be counterintuitive. But at the very least, we can say this. It's certainly very interesting, and it's important as like a kind of foil to the view that I associate with the two Fengs, Feng Youlan and Feng Youming, where it's merely an abstract universal. So I want to mention that this view that Lisa defends is best defended in her article in Philosophy East and West called Of Stones and Horses, short title. The full title is Of Stones and Horses, Reading the Gongsun Longzi in Terms of Concrete Universals. We highly recommend that too. But as a place to start, we recommend the with the Philosophy Compass. That's another philosophy journal article on the Gongsun Longzi, on the White Horse dialogue. Both of them are so well done, and we learned so much from them. Thank you, Lisa. What a delight for us to have you here to answer these questions in person and explain both the historical context and the philosophical presuppositions that are operating here. It was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the invitation, all the nice words. It's been a real pleasure, and I really enjoyed the experience. Thank you so much.
You're very kind. So I guess we will say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.